An ex-soldier saved a homeless man from a fire, not realizing he was a war buddy who could end his PTSD. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus as he stared at the local newspaper headline, his own face blurred in the background of the photo while firefighters doused the last of the flames. 3 days had passed since he'd pulled that man from the burning shelter, and still, his hands wouldn't stop trembling. The article called him a hero. Marcus knew better. Heroes didn't wake up screaming every night. Heroes didn't flinch at car backfires or duck at the sound of a door slamming. Heroes didn't live in apartments with the blinds permanently drawn, counting the days between therapy appointments like prisoners marking time on cell walls. Marcus folded the newspaper and tossed it into the recycling bin. The morning sunlight tried to creep through the narrow gap in his curtains, a persistent sliver of gold that felt like an accusation. Another day to be survived. He ran his fingers through his unkempt hair, feeling the coarse strands that had grown too long since his last haircut. Everything required too much effort these days. His phone buzzed on the counter. Doctor, Kinwafu non Pedidisurenter, Sharma again. Third missed call this week. I know, Marcus muttered to the empty room. I'll reschedule. The army had taught him structure. Wake, run, eat, train, sleep. Repeat until deployment. Repeat during deployment until something inside you breaks. Then come home with the pieces rattling around inside your chest like shrapnel that the surgeons couldn't extract. 4 years since his discharge, and Marcus still made his bed with military corners. Some habits survived even when the man who formed them was long gone. He smoothed the blanket, tucking it with precise movements, a small victory in a day that would offer few others. His apartment was sparse but meticulously organized, the residue of a military life that had shaped him since he was 18. Now at 32, the habits remained while the purpose had evaporated. A bookshelf held military history and crime novels that accumulated dust. The walls were bare except for a shadow box containing his medals and a folded flag. He never looked at them directly. The coffee maker gurgled, the only voice that spoke in his home most days. Marcus poured the black liquid into a mug that read, "World's okayest brother." A gift from his sister before she'd given up trying to pull him back into the family orbit. He hadn't returned her last 3 calls. Through the window, the April sky promised spring, but Marcus felt perpetually trapped in winter. The neighborhood was coming alive. Children waiting for school buses, commuters hurrying to cars, an elderly couple walking their terrier. Normal people leading normal lives unmarked by what he'd seen, what he'd done, what kept replaying in his mind. He sipped his coffee and tried to focus on his breathing the way Dr. Sharma had taught him. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. But his thoughts kept returning to the fire, to the acrid smoke filling his lungs as he'd kicked down that door, to the homeless man unconscious on the floor, his face obscured by soot and a matted beard. Something about the man's build, the angle of his shoulders even as he lay there. Something hauntingly familiar that Marcus couldn't place. The fire had started in the kitchen of the shelter. Marcus had been walking back from the corner store when he saw the smoke, heard the shouts. While others stood frozen on the sidewalk, his body had moved on autopilot, training kicking in. Clear the building. Assess for survivors. Establish a perimeter. He'd found the bearded man in the back room, dragged him out seconds before a ceiling beam collapsed. In the chaos afterward, the sirens, the paramedics, the questions, Marcus had slipped away. He couldn't handle the attention, the gratitude, the eyes that might suddenly recognize the fractures beneath his carefully maintained facade. Now the newspaper called him a hero, and he couldn't even remember the face of the man he'd saved. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from Dr. Sharma. The hospital called. The man you rescued is asking to see you. Might be good for your progress. Tuesday, 2 p.m., Memorial Hospital, room 412. Please consider it. Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. His heart stuttered, then raced, a familiar precursor to panic. Why would the man want to see him? What could Marcus possibly offer besides an awkward conversation and the constant risk of being triggered into an episode? He placed the phone face down on the counter and pressed his palms against the cool granite. Breathe. Just breathe. By late afternoon, after hours of pacing and failed attempts at distraction, Marcus found himself standing outside Memorial Hospital, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. 3 times he'd approached the automatic doors, and 3 times he'd backed away. A young nurse smoking by the side entrance noticed him on her break. "You look like you're about to storm the beaches or run away," she said, exhaling a plume of smoke that reminded Marcus of signal flares. "Neither one is as scary as you're making it." Her directness startled him. "I'm supposed to visit someone. Room number? 412. She nodded, crushed her cigarette under her shoe. 4th floor, turn right off the elevator. Whatever you're afraid of, it's probably worse in your head than in reality. If only she knew how wrong she was. In Marcus's experience, reality had always managed to exceed the horrors his imagination conjured. But something, perhaps the woman's matter-of-fact confidence, or simply the exhaustion of avoidance, propelled him forward. The elevator ride was a suspended moment of dread, each floor indicator light bringing him closer to an encounter he wasn't prepared for. Room 412 had a partially closed door. Marcus stood outside it, listening to the muted sound of a television, the steady beep of monitors. His palms were slick with sweat. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and forced air, reminding him of field hospitals of the worst days. He almost turned away again when a voice from inside called out, "Either come in or stop lurking. You're making my heart monitor go haywire." The voice, deep with a slight southern lilt, sent a jolt through Marcus's body. A voice from another life. Impossible. He pushed the door open. The man in the bed was thinner than Marcus remembered, his once powerful frame diminished by injury and what looked like months of hardship. The beard was gone now, revealing a face Marcus had once known as well as his own. A face he'd seen in his nightmares, covered in blood and dirt, screaming his name across a landscape of fire and metal. "Jackson," Marcus whispered, the name escaping before he could process what he was seeing. Staff Sergeant David Jackson, his squad leader, his mentor, his friend, smiled weakly from the hospital bed, his arms bandaged from burns, an oxygen tube in his nostrils. "Took you long enough, Cooper. I've been waiting 3 days for your slow ass to show up." Marcus gripped the doorframe to steady himself. This couldn't be real. David Jackson had died in the explosion that had ended Marcus's deployment and begun his nightmare. Marcus had seen the Humvee engulfed in flames, had heard Jackson's screams through the radio before the transmission cut to static, had received the folded flag at the memorial service where Jackson's empty coffin was lowered into Arlington soil. "You're dead," Marcus said flatly, the words falling like stones between them. Jackson's smile faded. "Yeah, that's what they told everyone. Easier that way, I guess." He gestured to the chair beside the bed with his bandaged hand. "Sit down before you fall down, Cooper. You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus moved mechanically to the chair, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before him. "How?" "We had a funeral." "Your mother?" "My mother got a flag and a lie," Jackson interrupted, his voice hardening. "Just like she got when my father didn't come back from Vietnam. It's a family tradition." He tried to shift in the bed and winced. The official story was easier than the truth. Wounded beyond usefulness, extensive facial reconstruction, psychological damage that made me unfit for service or public view. The Army decided I was better off dead. The clinical detachment in Jackson's voice made Marcus's stomach turn. This was how soldiers spoke about operations, about casualties, with a distance that made the unbearable momentarily manageable. "And you just accepted that?" Marcus asked, anger beginning to seep through his shock. "I was in a medically induced coma for the first 3 months. By the time I was conscious enough to have an opinion, the decision had been made." Jackson's eyes, the same intense blue Marcus remembered, now set in a face altered by scars and surgeries, locked onto his. "They told me everyone in the squad was dead, including you." The room seemed to tilt. Marcus gripped the arms of the chair. "They told us the same about you. Military efficiency. One story, universal application." Jackson's attempt at humor fell flat between them. "When I saw your face on the news, every pulling me out of that fire, I thought I was hallucinating. The drugs they've got me on are pretty good." Marcus leaned forward, studying the man before him. Despite the changes, the scars that pulled at the left side of his face, the missing earlobe, the differently shaped nose, the essence of Jackson was unmistakable. The way his eyes crinkled when he spoke, the particular tilt of his head when asking a question. "Where have you been?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years." Jackson looked away toward the window where afternoon sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds. "Rehab facilities, VA hospitals, halfway houses when I could function enough to qualify. Then nowhere specific. Everywhere. Nowhere." He paused. "The streets for the last 8 months. Turns out reconstructed war heroes with PTSD don't exactly thrive in civilian employment." The bitter edge in Jackson's voice was new. The man Marcus had known, the natural leader who could inspire loyalty with a glance, who carried extra ammunition so his men wouldn't have to, who wrote letters home for the soldier who couldn't read. That man had been burned away along with his former face. "I looked for you," Marcus said suddenly, the memory surfacing. After the explosion, I couldn't find you in the wreckage. They had to drag me away. I kept telling them you were still in there. Something flickered in Jackson's eyes. Surprise or perhaps pain. They never told me that. A nurse entered, breaking the charged atmosphere. She checked Jackson's vitals, adjusted his IV, and gave Marcus an appraising look. You must be the firefighter he's been asking about. Good timing, he needs to rest soon. Not a firefighter, Marcus corrected automatically. Just happened to be there. Happened to be there, Jackson repeated after the nurse left. Some things never change. You always happened to be wherever the worst shit was going down. The familiar banter, however strained, unlocked something in Marcus's chest. A pressure valve releasing after years of containment, says the man who volunteered us for every suicide mission from Fallujah to Kandahar. For a moment, they were back there. Not in the horror of battle, but in the brotherhood that had preceded it. The camaraderie that had made the unbearable briefly bearable. Why were you at that shelter? Marcus asked, steering away from memories that threatened to overwhelm him. Jackson's expression shuddered. Same reason anyone's at a shelter. Nowhere else to go. He adjusted the thin hospital blanket with his bandaged hands. Look, I didn't ask them to find you because I wanted a pity party. He trailed off, seeming suddenly uncertain. I needed to see for myself that you made it. That something good came out of that day. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Good? There was nothing good about his survival, about the half-life he'd been living since his discharge. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the isolation. He wanted to tell Jackson that he was wrong, that Marcus Cooper had died in that explosion too, leaving only a hollow facsimile that moved through the world without truly living in it. Instead, he said, "When do they release you?" Jackson gave a short, humorless laugh. Into whose care exactly? The shelter's gone. My VA benefits got tangled in bureaucracy 3 states ago. I lost my ID in Denver. He shrugged, then winced at the movement. They'll patch me up, give me some burn cream and painkillers, and point me toward the nearest homeless outreach program. The thought of Jackson, the man who had saved his life more times than Marcus could count, being discharged onto the streets made something fundamental shift inside him. A long-dormant protective instinct stirred. You can stay with me, Marcus said, surprising himself. Until you get back on your feet. Jackson studied him with those 2 perceptive eyes. You sure about that, Cooper? You look like you're barely standing yourself. The assessment was accurate and cut to the quick. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt something besides numbness or terror. Purpose, maybe, or obligation. Or simply the pull of a bond that had been forged in conditions few would ever understand. I've got a pull-out couch and decent water pressure, Marcus said. It's not much, but it's better than the alternative. Jackson was silent for a long moment, pride warring visibly with necessity on his altered face. Finally, he nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement. Temporary, until I sort something out. Of course, Marcus agreed, though both men recognized the lie. There was nothing temporary about the damage they carried, nothing easily sorted about lives derailed by war and its aftermath. As visiting hours ended and Marcus prepared to leave, a thought occurred to him. They'll need your discharge information. Emergency contacts. Jackson's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile on his old face. Put yourself down, Cooper. Apparently you're all I've got. The words followed Marcus out of the hospital and into the fading daylight, a weight and a possibility all at once. As he walked back to his apartment to prepare for a guest he never expected, Marcus realized his hands had stopped shaking for the first time in years. 3 days later, Marcus helped Jackson navigate the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment. The hospital had released him with a supply of burn cream, pain medication, and a follow-up appointment that Jackson had already declared he wouldn't attend. Christ, Cooper, you live like a monk, Jackson observed as he entered the Spartan apartment. His movements were stiff, his burns still painful despite the medication. Or a serial killer. Jury's out. Marcus found himself surveying his living space through Jackson's eyes. The minimal furniture, the absence of personal touches, the military precision of every object's placement. Haven't had much reason to decorate. Jackson lowered himself carefully onto the couch that would serve as his bed. No girlfriends demanding throw pillows? No buddies bringing over ugly souvenirs? The questions probed the empty spaces of Marcus's life with uncomfortable accuracy. Haven't had much reason for that either. Something in his tone must have communicated more than his words because Jackson didn't push further. Instead, he glanced at the shadow box on the wall, the only personal item in the entire apartment. Still got your hardware? He noted. Never took you for the type to display it? Marcus followed his gaze to the medals he never looked at directly. My sister's idea. She thought it would help with... He trailed off, unsure how to articulate the complex tangle of pride, shame, and trauma that accompanied those decorations. The aftermath, Jackson supplied, the two words encompassing everything they didn't have language for. Yeah, they fell into an uneasy silence. The afternoon stretched before them, empty of structure or purpose. Two soldiers, without a mission, without orders, adrift in civilian time that expanded and contracted without the rigid boundaries of military schedules. Marcus cleared his throat. Are you hungry? I could order something. Jackson nodded, relief visible in the loosening of his shoulders. Starving. Hospital food makes MREs look gourmet. The familiar complaint, so reminiscent of their days in the field, loosened something in Marcus's chest. He ordered Chinese food, enough for several meals, and tried not to notice how Jackson's eyes widened at the casualness with which he spent money on takeout. As they ate directly from the containers, seated at Marcus's small kitchen table, Jackson broke the silence again. So what do you do now? For work? Marcus concentrated on manipulating his chopsticks. Security consulting mostly. Remote work. Companies hire vets to analyze their systems, identify vulnerabilities. Sounds quiet. That's the point. Jackson nodded, understanding without needing elaboration. After what they'd experienced, quiet was a commodity more valuable than money or status. Quiet meant safety, meant no unexpected explosions, no sudden gunfire, no screams of wounded men. And Jackson gestured vaguely toward his own head. How's that going for you? The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard. In civilian life, people danced around his condition, used euphemisms, avoided asking directly about the darkness that sometimes claimed him. Jackson's bluntness was refreshingly military. PTSD's a bitch, Marcus admitted. Some days are better than others. Jackson set down his container of lo mein. You getting help? Real help, not just VA bullshit. I have a therapist, Dr. Sharma. She's persistent. Good. Hold on to that. Jackson's face darkened. I had one in Colorado, before my benefits got tangled up. Best 3 months of the last 4 years. They ate in silence for a while, the unspoken weight of shared experience hanging between them. Both men recognized the fragility of their current stability, how easily it could be disrupted by a backfiring car, a helicopter overhead, a nightmare that wouldn't release its grip. Later, as Marcus prepared the pull-out couch with sheets and blankets, Jackson stood by the window, looking out at the street below. His silhouette against the fading light reminded Marcus so forcefully of nights in Afghanistan, Jackson taking the last watch, outlined against the desert dawn, that for a moment, time collapsed entirely. You okay, Cooper? Jackson asked without turning around. He had always had an uncanny awareness of his men's mental states. Marcus realized he'd stopped moving, holding a pillow midair. Yeah. Just remembering. Jackson nodded, still facing the window. Happens to me too. Time gets slippery. It was the perfect word for the disorienting sensation of being simultaneously in the present and the past, never fully anchored in either. Slippery, like trying to hold onto sand in a rushing stream. If you need anything in the night, Marcus began. I know where to find you, Jackson finished. Then with characteristic directness, same goes. If you start screaming or sleepwalking or whatever form your particular demons take, I'm a light sleeper. The acknowledgement of their shared brokenness was oddly comforting. No need for pretense between them. No need to maintain the facade of normalcy that civilian interactions demanded. That night, lying in his perfectly made bed, Marcus listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving in his space. The creak of the couch springs, the running water in the bathroom, the soft pad of feet on hardwood. Sounds that should have triggered his hypervigilance, but somehow had the opposite effect. For the first time in years, Marcus fell asleep without his usual ritual of checking locks, without the background noise of a television to drown out his thoughts. He slept and did not dream. He woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving in his kitchen. For a disorienting moment, he reached for a weapon that wasn't there, adrenaline spiking, then remembered. Jackson, the hospital, the improbable reunion. Marcus found his former squad leader standing at the stove, awkwardly flipping pancakes with his bandaged hands. Hope you don't mind, Jackson said without turning around. Found flour and eggs. Figured I should earn my keep. I didn't know I had flour, Marcus admitted, pouring himself coffee from the pot Jackson had already made. Behind the protein powder and under the arsenal of energy bars. Your pantry has a very distinct preparing for apocalypse vibe. The casual observation made Marcus smile, a small, rusty movement that felt foreign on his face. When was the last time he'd smiled? He couldn't remember. They established a routine over the following days, finding their way around each other in the small apartment. Jackson insisted on handling meals despite his injured hands, revealing a surprising talent for improvising with limited ingredients. Marcus found himself actually looking forward to eating rather than viewing food as merely necessary fuel. They avoided talking about the past directly, focusing instead on practical matters. Jackson's follow-up medical appointments, the forms needed to reinstate his benefits, the search for replacement identification. But the past hovered between them, an unacknowledged presence that sometimes manifested in shared glances when a helicopter passed overhead, or in the way both men positioned themselves with clear sightlines to exits when in public spaces. A week into their arrangement, Marcus received a call from Dr. Sharma during one of their scheduled phone sessions. "Your voice sounds different," she observed. "Have you been sleeping better?" Marcus considered the question. He had been sleeping better, with fewer nightmares and an ease of falling asleep that had eluded him for years. "Someone from my old unit is staying with me temporarily," he said, sidestepping her question. "The man you rescued from the fire?" Her voice sharpened with interest. "That's quite a coincidence." "Yeah." Marcus wasn't ready to explain the full complexity of the situation, how Jackson had been presumed dead, how his reappearance had simultaneously reopened old wounds and offered a strange kind of healing. "How do you feel about having someone in your space?" "Doctor," Sharma pressed. "You've been very protective of your solitude." Marcus watched through the window as Jackson sat on the fire escape, smoking a cigarette in the afternoon sun, his face tilted upward like a plant seeking light. "It's not as hard as I thought it would be." That night, the equilibrium they'd established shattered. Marcus woke to shouting, disoriented in the darkness. For a moment, he thought the cries were his own, until he recognized Jackson's voice, raw with terror, coming from the living room. He found Jackson tangled in the sheets of the pull-out couch, fighting invisible enemies, his bandaged hands raised in defense against attacks only he could see. "Jackson," Marcus called, keeping his distance, knowing from experience the danger of touching someone trapped in a flashback. "Jackson, you're in Boston. In my apartment. You're safe." The words didn't penetrate. Jackson continued to struggle, his movements growing more frantic, his breathing rapid and shallow. Sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the dim light from the street lamps outside. Marcus recognized the signs of a severe episode, had experienced enough of them himself to know that Jackson was lost in a hellscape of memory, unable to distinguish past from present. He moved closer, speaking in the calm, authoritative tone they'd used in combat situations. "Staff Sergeant Jackson, stand down." "That's an order." The military command cut through where gentler approaches had failed. Jackson stilled, his breathing still rapid but his movements less frantic. "Cooper?" he gasped, his eyes wild but beginning to focus. "Right here. You're in Boston. My apartment. It's 2023. You're safe." Jackson struggled to sit up, his bandaged hands clutching at the tangled sheets. "Fuck." He breathed the single word laden with shame and exhaustion. "Sorry. Don't be." Marcus moved carefully to sit on the edge of the pull-out couch, maintaining enough distance to avoid crowding Jackson's space. "Happens to the best of us." They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound Jackson's gradually slowing breaths. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "It was the ambush outside Kandahar, the one where we lost Martinez and Diaz." Marcus nodded. That day was seared into his memory too. The sudden explosion that disabled their lead vehicle, the gunfire from all sides, the desperate scramble for cover. Martinez had died instantly. Diaz had bled out despite their frantic attempts to save him, Jackson holding pressure on the wound while Marcus returned fire. "I keep seeing Diaz's face," Jackson continued, staring at his hands as if he could still see the blood. "Keep hearing him ask if he was going to die." "What the fuck was I supposed to tell him?" "You told him he'd be fine," Marcus remembered. "That the medevac was 5 minutes out, that he just needed to hold on." "I lied to a dying man. You gave him comfort." Marcus met Jackson's tortured gaze. "That's not the same as lying." Jackson ran a bandaged hand over his face. "Some nights I see all of them. Martinez, Diaz, Wilcox, Chen. And you." The admission hung in the air between them. Marcus understood with sudden clarity that in Jackson's nightmares, he was among the dead, Just as in Marcus's own recurring dreams, Jackson burned in that Humvee night after night, never to be rescued. "I'm right here," Marcus said quietly. "And so are you." Something shifted in Jackson's expression. A softening, a vulnerability rarely permitted in the hyper-masculine world they'd inhabited. "Yeah," he agreed. "Somehow we're both still here." Neither man returned to sleep that night. Instead, they sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, the fluorescent light casting harsh shadows on their faces. For the first time, they spoke directly about what had happened in those final days of their deployment. The intelligence that had been faulty, the ambush that had separated their squad, the explosion that had nearly killed them both. "They told me you were evacuated," Jackson said, cradling his mug with bandaged fingers. "That you'd been taken out with the first wave of wounded." When the Humvee went up, his voice faltered. "I thought you were in it." Marcus shook his head. "I was looking for you. When the second IED hit, I was about 50 yards east, checking the buildings where we'd last had radio contact. The revelation settled between them. How close they'd both come to death. How arbitrary survival had been. Not a matter of skill or deserving, but of simple geography. 50 yards. The difference between life and death. Between 4 years of thinking, the other gone forever. "What happened after?" Marcus asked. "After they declared you dead?" Jackson's face tightened. "Woke up in Germany. Face bandaged so completely I couldn't see. Multiple surgeries. Skin grafts. Reconstruction." He gestured to his altered features. "When they were done, they showed me a mirror and asked if I wanted to contact my family. Let them know I was alive. But you didn't. My mother had already buried my father and received a folded flag. Then buried an empty box with my name on it and received another flag." Jackson's voice was flat. "What was I supposed to say? Surprise I'm alive, but so damaged I'll never be the son you remember. Better for her to grieve a hero than watch me deteriorate." The harsh assessment made Marcus wince. "Is that what happened? You deteriorated?" Jackson's laugh was bitter. What would you call it? Discharged with honors but no functional support system. Addiction to pain meds within 6 months. Rehab, halfway houses. Jobs I couldn't keep because I couldn't remember instructions or would freak out at loud noises." He stared into his coffee. The street was just the last stop on a downward trajectory. The familiar contours of Jackson's story, so similar to countless veterans Marcus had known, so easily could have been his own fate, made his chest ache. But there was something else in the pain, a current of anger that felt strangely energizing. "It shouldn't be like this," Marcus said, the words emerging with unexpected force. "Not for you. Not for any of us." Jackson looked up, surprised by the vehemence in Marcus's voice. "Yeah, well, welcome to civilian life, Cooper. Nobody gives a shit once the uniform comes off." The cynicism was justified, but somehow intolerable coming from Jackson. The man who had once embodied resilience and leadership, who had inspired his squad through the worst days with unshakable optimism. "I give a shit," Marcus said quietly. Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, a brief kindling of the man he had once been. "Yeah," he acknowledged. "I'm starting to see that." In the gray light of dawn, they made a pact without explicitly stating it, a silent agreement that whatever came next, they would face it together. The bond that had been forged in combat, broken by presumed death, had somehow survived against impossible odds. Neither man was willing to relinquish it again. When spring advanced into summer, Jackson's burns healed, leaving new scars to join the old. With Marcus's help, he navigated the Byzantine processes required to reinstate his benefits, replace his identification, and register for the support services available to veterans. The pull-out couch became a permanent sleeping arrangement. Neither man discussed Jackson finding his own place, though both knew the apartment was too small for comfortable cohabitation. Some discomforts were easier to bear than the prospect of separation. Marcus noticed changes in himself that were subtle but significant. The pervasive anxiety that had been his constant companion began to recede. He started leaving the blinds open during the day, allowing sunlight to fill the apartment. He answered his sister's calls. He attended therapy in person rather than via phone. Dr. Sharma noted the improvements without directly attributing them to Jackson's presence. "You're engaging more," she observed during one session. "Taking more risks." Marcus thought about the previous weekend, when he and Jackson had attended an outdoor concert in the park. Something that would have been unthinkable months earlier, with its crowds and unpredictable noises. They'd stayed on the periphery, positioned with clear sightlines and escape routes, but they had stayed for the entire performance. "I have backup now," he told her. the military terminology feeling more natural than clinical alternatives. Jackson, too, was changing, regaining fragments of his former self. The bitter edge that had characterized him in the hospital softened. He began to laugh more, to tell stories from before the war, his childhood in rural Georgia, college football scholarships declined in favor of enlistment, the stray dog he'd adopted against regulations during their first deployment. One sweltering July evening, as they sat on the fire escape sharing a six-pack of beer, Jackson broached a subject they'd been avoiding. "I've been thinking about my mother," he said, peeling the label from his bottle in methodical strips. "About contacting her." Marcus went still. "Yeah, she's 73 now. Lives in that same house in Macon." Jackson kept his eyes on the beer bottle. "I found her on Facebook. My cousin set it up for her. She posts pictures of her garden and her church group." The wistfulness in Jackson's voice made Marcus's throat tighten. "Are you going to call her?" "I don't know." Jackson set the bottle down, label completely removed and shredded into tiny pieces. "What would it do to her? Thinking I was dead for years, then suddenly I'm not? And looking like this?" He gestured to his scarred face. "Might be cruel rather than kind." Marcus considered the question seriously, understanding its weight. "My sister once told me the worst part wasn't the not knowing if I was okay," he said slowly. "It was knowing I was suffering and not letting her help." Jackson absorbed this, his expression contemplative. "Your sister sounds smart. Smarter than both of us combined." They fell silent, watching the neighborhood below as evening deepened into night. Families returning from dinner, couples walking dogs, teenagers congregating on stoops. The ordinary pageant of civilian life that had once seemed so foreign, so unattainable. "If you decide to contact her," Marcus said finally, "I'll go with you. To Macon. If you want." The offer hung between them, laden with implications neither man was ready to articulate. The possibility of a future beyond mere survival. A commitment to something beyond their shared past. Jackson's hand found Marcus's in the darkness. A brief grip of acknowledgement. "I'll think about it." 2 weeks later, they were in Marcus's car, driving south on I-95. Jackson had called his mother the previous day, a conversation that had lasted 4 hours and left both men emotionally drained. She had wept, cursed the military, wept again, then immediately started planning what she would cook for them upon arrival. "She didn't ask about my face," Jackson said as they crossed into Virginia, the landscape gradually transforming from the northeast's dense greenery to the more open spaces of the south. "Not once. She's your mother," Marcus replied, eyes on the road. "She doesn't care about your face. She asked about you, though." "A lot of questions." Jackson's tone was carefully neutral. "Wanted to know if you were the same Marcus Cooper I used to write home about." Marcus felt heat rise to his face. "What did you tell her? That you were better and worse?" "Just like me." Jackson stared out the window at the passing countryside. "That we were helping each other find our way back." The simple truth of the statement settled between them, comfortable in its honesty. They were helping each other find their way back, not to who they had been before the war. Those men were irretrievably gone, but to some new version of themselves that could incorporate both the damage and the healing. As they continued south, Marcus felt the invisible weight he'd carried for years growing lighter with each mile. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty. Whatever came next, in Macon, in Boston, in the complex landscape of recovery, they would navigate it together. For the first time since returning from war, Marcus Cooper didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own life. With Jackson beside him, both of them scarred but improbably alive, he felt something he had thought lost forever in the explosion that had nearly claimed them both. He felt like he had come home,